I think the takeaway message for this conference is trust in McGill and trust in Wilson Center. I like that, and that will be our new motto.
There's a T-shirt there.
There's a T-shirt there. So this is the Rigby and Sand show. We've done this a couple of times before. We're going to be very brief because we are all that stands between you and a glass of wine and your weekend, as Jeff kept on reminding you.
However, if you leave early, there's no drinks, so you have to stay here.
Yeah, to the bitter end, very bitter end. First of all, before I just make a few summing up remarks, thank you to the panelists. They were absolutely fabulous. I thought they were excellent. Thank you to the audience. Very interactive, very engaged. I thought those were great discussions. There was a lot there over those 5 panels. We packed a lot in. We were a little bit concerned about how much we packed into some of those individual panel sessions. There was some overlap, et cetera, but at the end of the day, it was an incredibly rich discussion. We got a lot out of it, and I hope you did too. And again, on my side, just a final shout out to the support staff at Max Bell, my 2 trusty RAs, Gagan and Michael, and Weston and others who've been outside. They've done a phenomenal job. So I thank them. So we're not going to, in 15 minutes, sum up everything that was said today, but I want to make just maybe a few quick points, probably through a Canadian lens primarily. So you'll probably tackle some of the U.S. perspectives, but from a Canadian perspective, I've got to say that the Canada-U.S. relationship is going to potentially be tested by this. And it was very interesting that near the end, I think it was Graham said, we haven't mentioned the word Trump very much today. And he did come up on a few occasions. But if we look down the road at a potential Trump presidency or a Biden presidency, for that matter, and the China-U.S. relationship on its current trajectory, if it takes a nosedive, the U.S. is going to be looking to allies in a serious way to step up, in a very serious way. And they've done that to a considerable extent already. I can tell you on the Trump presidency over 5G and Huawei, we got a full court press from the Americans to get in line and get in line fast, including with a delegation that came to Canada and lectured us a little bit on it. We can expect more of that. And so this is going to be, I think, potentially a test case, China, for that relationship. And it could be the same under Biden as well, as I say, if the trajectory continues on its current course. And the primordial nature of the Canada-U.S. relationship is really going to be at stake, I think, to a considerable extent. I heard some interesting language, in particular from the officials today, about how Canada is going to have a China policy that's going to be in its own national interest. Well, yeah, absolutely, it should be in Canada's own national interest, but Canada's national interest also involves getting along with the United States and making sure that we're a loyal ally. I heard comments about we're not friends with the United States. They're an ally and a partner, but we're not necessarily friends. No, fair enough, but they're still a pretty important ally. I heard comments about the interdependence of the relationship and comments about lots and lots of stuff was getting done. Okay, and I know from my own previous experience that yes, lots gets done, but we're potentially coming to an important turning point, I think, on this if things do get rather intense in the Indo-Pacific region or hostile state activities pick up in a serious way. Thomas Juneau mentioned in that first panel about Canada's reputation on the world stage these days is not necessarily the best, and I think we're a little bit in the red in Washington. And so on the national security side in particular, I think we got to step up. And we talked about convergence and areas where we can work better together. I think oftentimes it's going to be for the Americans, well, we'll work better for you when you step up. And if you do X, we'll do Y. You want to join AUKUS? Well, do the following. Maybe we can help out a little bit. So there's going to be a little bit of quid pro quo there. And I think that is particularly the case on the national security side. And so I found it was really interesting that we had a heated debate in the first panel over how huge it was that a frigate was going through the Taiwan Strait. And I'm going, yeah, we're not even talking about how many frigates we actually have in the Indo-Pacific region. The Indo-Pacific strategy announced a huge increase of 2 to 3 frigates in the Indo-Pacific region. There's very little in the Indo-Pacific strategy about security. There's very little about China, apart from the fact that China was labeled a disruptive power. and it is a hostile state actor. But when it came down to actual hard security, there's very, very little in the Indo-Pacific strategy. There's very little in the Canadian defense policy update as well. If you look at it, very focused on the Arctic. There's certainly stuff there in terms of international expeditionary capability and what have you. But if things go really, really bad in the Indo-Pacific, in 2027, I don't think it's going to necessarily go that way in 2027, but that's a date that keeps on coming up. Our capabilities are going to be fairly limited. One of the interesting things I found that would have really been helpful for an Indo-Pacific strategy was that we develop a submarine capability, because we effectively don't have any submarines. But in the defense update, it was we will explore submarines, and that's it. And our frigates, single surface combatants, 2040, maybe. We have huge procurement issues. So I'm a little bit concerned about that and our ability to step up. And even at home, there are a lot of comments today about Bill C-70. We're starting to get, I think Jenny said, we're cleaning up our backyard. Things are starting to happen. Yeah, things are starting to happen. But I've had this comment made to me by political staff many times over the years. They're the first to admit that when it comes to a lot of this stuff at home on national security, it's piecemeal. And it's a little bit here, it's a little bit there, and it's responsive. And it needs to get done only when the pressure is put on and backed into a corner. I like Thomas Juneau's idea, and I've come out publicly about this, including in that article in the Globe earlier this week, that we need a national security strategy, and quite frankly, with a focus on China probably when it comes to stuff at home. And I think that would mean a lot for the United States to see that. And I know it's only a piece of paper, and you still got to implement it, but let's see something that's a little bit more holistic. Two other quick points, not so much from a Canadian perspective. I said at the outset that, let's look today at convergence, divergence, Canada-US, but I also said you can't do it purely in a Canada-US context. And that came up repeatedly through the day, and I was glad to see that. And it was particularly in the case in the human rights session where Jennifer and others said, there's this multilateral angle that we should be looking at and working with the multilateral organizations and where Canada has experience and the US has experience, challenging China more, China perhaps putting more emphasis or using more innovative tactics, turning to the global South, et cetera, for support. So how do we engage them on that front? And the global South writ large, which came up again and again, we had a great event here a couple of weeks ago for Global South ambassadors. It was student-led. Students did an amazing job pulling it together. And the message, I asked them directly at one point over the dinner, you guys barely mentioned China. And when I asked the question, they said, well, listen, quite frankly, the Chinese make more of an effort with us. That's their view. They make more of an effort. And you guys just seem to assume that when you snap your fingers, like we did to a certain extent with Ukraine, you're going to fall into line. And I'm sorry, those days are over. That's not going to happen anymore. So you better pull up your socks and work a little bit harder. I think we have to do that in G20. Global South. And I think also I heard repeated references to G7 and Five Eyes, et cetera. We need to work more closely, I think, in that context as well. It's not just about Canada, US. Finally, the final panel, which I thought was great. I don't think it's a matter of being gloomy, pessimistic, optimistic. I think at the end of the day, I think Sandra captured it well, and one or two others too, is that you seize the opportunities when they arise. I don't think there's necessarily a grand strategy of cooperation with China and identifying the buckets, then going to them on bended knee and saying, we want to work on this, we want to work on that. I think they will emerge as they emerge, and we'll see them. I think Paul, right at the outset, made a great point. There's already a lot going on, and we can build on that to a considerable extent. I remember the China Council when I was at CETA, Jeff. Margaret Biggs heading off to China to have those conversations, and other mechanisms that we have in that regard. So Paul mentioned the Arctic. Arctic wasn't mentioned a lot today, but maybe we can work with China in the Arctic. I know we always see them as a threat, and I often identify them as a threat, but maybe through the Arctic Council, there's a way we can do some work with them. They're on the one hand, we don't want them there, but they're going to be there whether we like it or not. They are, and so maybe there are some areas we can work on. And I like the idea of non-proliferation, as Paul said. This was one of our strengths about 20 years ago. I think Canada should be really trying to find that muscle memory when it comes to non-proliferation. One thing we didn't mention was disaster response, emergency response, which is actually identified in the Indo-Pacific strategy as something we want to work on more in ASEAN, Southeast Asia. Maybe we can do something with China in that regard as well. So I will stop there, kind of random points. But my main message, I think, is just from a Canadian perspective, and I'd be curious, we can have this discussion over a glass of wine, how some of my Canadian colleagues feel, but we could potentially really be under the gun here with the United States very, very soon on China. Great article in the most recent Foreign Affairs by Pottinger and Gallagher. I don't know if any of you have read it. It's quite something. And I mean, I don't think Pottinger is going to be in a new administration, given the way he was with Mr. Trump near the end of the last presidency. But they're probably sort of slightly more moderate on China within the Republican Party, and it was pretty extreme. So look out; they'll be looking to friends and allies. So I will stop there. Thank you again, everybody. It was a great conference. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I do. And again, trust in McGill and Wilson Center.
Yep. I'm going to pick. Yes. Thank you. I'm just going to add a couple of points building on that. We started this conference with the idea of an Ascendant China. We talked a little bit about why we thought Ascendant was really important. And one thing that came out very early was the very serious risk of a real confrontation, 2027, a war, etc. And it made me think a little bit. A lot of people think the U.S. has this sort of fixation on a Cold War with China. And I think the Cold War sometimes gets a bad rap. I mean, what was the Cold War? It was a long attempt to avoid a hot war. And the idea that there is a real risk of violent conflict that could be quite devastating. I mean, I don't know about the numbers about who loses how much GDP. That seemed a bit of fuzzy math to me. But still, it would be serious. And yet it can be avoided. And there are ways that we can lower the pressure and lower the risk. The long twilight struggle is not a bad outcome here, better than one of the alternatives. So what I picked up from this discussion again and again were really creative ideas on how we can lower that risk. Nicole Giles talked about recognizing that our deep integration between Canada and the United States is both a source of some challenge, but also some advantage that can really be helpful to us and should be part of how we talk to each other. I find all the time that the foreign policy community is very good talking to the Canadians, but the domestic policy community, which plays an increasingly good role, doesn't necessarily have the same skill, deftness, resources, knowledge of how Canada works. And we need to thicken our relationship in that sense, get more people involved. We heard it from Thomas Juneau and several people. Canada is, we have to say, recovering from a bad case of fiscal laryngitis. Your voice around the world has been muted because you've defunded defense, defunded diplomacy, really let your development budget down. But I know you're trying to recover, and they're, maybe could be recovering faster. We always want to get better faster, but that's significant. There's a real Canadian commitment there, which I think is important and a good lesson to take back to Washington. Finding Chinese we can talk to. At one of our previous meetings, John Grutzner made the point that it isn't a conflict with China. It may be a conflict with the current regime, but cultural exchange, cultural ties, ways that we can build a people-to-people connection are really important. Also, protecting our citizens from transnational repression, that came up, and it was an echo for me of something that we've talked about at Wilson, which is Canada's great initiative on hostage diplomacy, arbitrary detention. Canada can be a focal point for conversations we need to have about what the boundaries of conflict should be, what's cricket, what's not cricket. I guess we don't say that in North America, it's a British thing, but what's Canadian football, American football? No. Anyway, I think that's very useful. Multilateral cooperation also came up as something, and Canada's always been a leader in trying to give life to the institutions that we have. I think Jennifer Welsh asked the important question, is the UN the right institution? Is the WTO the right institution? Do we need a reboot? Do we need to start building some new ones? I always remember John Holmes in Life with Uncle talks a little bit about, if you remember the book, if you remember The Diplomat, he talks about the way in which the post-war era, we look back and we think, the Americans had a great plan, Bretton Woods, United Nations, it all came together. But actually it was experimentation, and we kept trying things here and there, and I think we still are. And I think Canada could be very well part of our experimenting with what's the right structure, how do we cooperate, what do we need that we don't have? and we should be open to that. And I think coming back to something that my colleague Robert Daly said, which I thought was very good and was echoed by several other people, we have to have common language. We have to know what we're talking about. Influence operations very fuzzy. But if we can talk about, well, this is gray zone attack, this is, something that's pretty trivial and probably not going to move the needle. We need to be precise. We need to have real language. We need to agree what that language is when we're talking about things. Very useful discussion, I thought, in the fourth panel, about thinking about the Uyghurs and the Tibetans as part of an imperial phase in China's thinking. We know what imperialism's like. Americans always try to push against that for a long time. We used to have that as a bilateral issue. And we pushed against it by promoting sovereignty, promoting countries standing up for themselves. I know there are some people in Washington who wish we hadn't done so much of that with Canada, because we'd like them to be a little bit more, taking orders from us. But to be honest, I don't think promoting Canadian independence and making your own decisions different from Britain has been a bad idea. It's meant that when you agree for real. And that is the essence of the Canada-US partnership. And we can definitely strengthen that and make that go forward. I last time we met, I think we had a long discussion of the seas. Trudeau had the seas, confrontation, cooperation. And I'm also inspired by Robert Daly and his work with Sesame Street. I always feel, to quote a blue monster, C is for Canada, and that's good enough for me. So, oh yeah, it's also for Cookie Monster, which is good. The problem is, Cookie Monster, now they say cookies are a sometime thing, not an all the time thing. But for me, Canada's an all the time thing, so I'm very happy. But maybe I thought that one of the best thoughts that came out of this is in our last panel, and Paul Evans brought up, but also so did Jeff Nankerville, this idea of multiplying the contacts among thinking people, which is what this conference did. And I'm really pleased that my colleague Shoko Goto, Robert is here, my two great folks, Xavi Delgado and Quinlan Gray, who were in the back, and all the McGill Max Bell students who came, and many of you stayed throughout. Your participation, whether you were speaking or whether you were talking to us in the hallways, it was really great. So this is how we get the Canada-US relationship on track, because I think that's what this was really about. I said at the beginning, it was like an old married couple. They don't talk to each other as much as we do, but when we have a guest in the room, we suddenly hear our best stories as we tell them to the other. And so if this was marriage therapy for Canada-US relations, I think it came out okay. So thanks, everybody. Thanks.